Hello and welcome to the Kianistan Podcast. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words of appreciation for you, the viewers. I'm really glad, I'm really pleased and really humbled to see this amazing community we're building full of intelligence and diversity. We're getting viewers from all over the world, Jamaica, New Zealand, Canada, all over Europe, all over West Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Americas. It's really amazing to see this. And also, normally when people talk about geopolitics, it seems like it's a domain for grumpy old men. But in our case, that's not true at all. We have like people, our viewers are of all age ranges. We have a really healthy participation of female viewers and lots of females leaving comments on the videos as well, which is really pleasing for me to see. So I just wanted to really say thank you to all the viewers who have been with us from start, as well as those who are joining recently, because we've noticed that the YouTube algorithm is really benefiting us at the moment. We're getting a lot of traction, and all of this is entirely due to you guys. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Please do keep watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And do leave comments. I'm always so happy to see your comments, anything positive, negative, even just to say hello, do leave a comment. With that said, we'll get started. Today, our guest joining us today is Professor Richard Sakwa. He has joined us previously. Professor Sakwa is a professor at University of Kent in England, and he is known for his work on Russian politics and European international relations and foreign policy. We'll get started. I'm really looking forward to this interview, and we'll get started straight after this. Richard, thank you for joining us. How are you?
It's my pleasure to be with you again. I'm fine.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm really pleased. Thank you so much. So, Richard, as we're both in the UK, I thought maybe we can start from here. Just looking at this war in Ukraine and the role of UK. To me, it just seems like UK has had a very aggressive stance from the beginning. It doesn't seem like we've made much of an effort to build bridges and maybe push diplomacy and negotiations. Is that the case, or am I missing something? How do you see the role of UK in this current war?
If anything, you're putting it rather mildly. The UK, from the start, has been perhaps the most aggressive of the European states, and the most sort of uncritical in its assessment of the situation. And this has led to a policy which could potentially have profound blowback effects on the UK itself. This goes all the way back to the beginning, 2014, of this particular phase of the crisis. But it also, you could, the big question always is, when did the Ukraine war start? And the associated question is, who started it?
Yes.
And of course, we could pick any date we like, but clearly we have to look at the whole 30-odd years since the end of the first Cold War. It's not just a question of NATO enlargement. Of course, that's important, but it's the failure of what I call the political West. That is the Atlantic system, the Atlantic alliance system, the Euro-Atlantic alliance, established since 1945, forged in the Cold War, which simply could not accept a post-communist Russia to become a member. But it's not just a member. Russia would insist on being an equal member, and that simply was not acceptable. A major nuclear power, another member of the UN Security Council, would have unbalanced the political West. And so clearly we need to go back to the early post-war years, the 1990s. But in all of this, the United Kingdom has not played, if I may put it this way, a positive role to understand the positions. Yeah, Tony Blair in his early times tried to, bring Russia in, but classically with New Labour, this was lacked deep conceptual or even fundamental, even geopolitical underpinnings. And of course, the United Kingdom was one of the most enthusiastic bombers of Serbia in 1999. So it's all part of a piece. Just one final point is that to take us up to contemporary times, Keir Starmer, of course, was devoid of ideas entirely, as we know domestically. and dithering, promising change. And when he asked Keir Starmer, what change, he said big changes. So what big changes? Profound changes. And it would go around in endless circles like that, and perhaps kicked off to a commission which would report back in 2028. But on foreign policy, he's considered to have been more successful. Well, my measure of success would be putting an end to the Ukrainian war, at least to tempering it, putting an end to the West Asian wars, of which there's a multitude, and many other global issues. I do not see, maybe I'm missing something, but as far as I can see, Keir Starmer did not actually contribute to the alleviation of human suffering one jot. In fact, he added to it and, in fact, endorsed it when it comes to West Asia. And of course, we've got a new prime minister now. And within the first 2 weeks, he hosted Zelensky in Portsmouth. And of course, a few people have told me that he's got off to a very fine start, and certainly a very active start. This is Andy Burnham. Yes. But the great criticism of him is the almost obsequious way he greeted Zelensky in Portsmouth. And of course, foreign policy is not one of Andy Burnham's strong suites. And most of his team and foreign policy team are hangovers from the earlier time. But maybe he'll find his feet. Maybe he'll begin to understand that these issues do require addressing.
Yes. Richard, you're so right. I personally was baffled when we had the Labour government coming in after Boris Johnson and after the Tories. I thought that was like an ideal opportunity for us to reassess our position and reassess the direction this war is going into, and maybe readjust our foreign policy. But none of that happened, and instead we've just doubled down on what was going on in with the previous governments. And we've seen pretty much the same with Trump. When he came before him, we had Biden, and I thought it was an ideal opportunity for Trump to say, this is not my war and I had nothing to do with it, but I'm going to try my best to end it. But him as well, it seems like he's doubling down on not just the Russian war, but also what's going on in West Asia as well. So why is it that there seems to be no opposition, at least in the UK and in Europe, for what's happening?
In fact, Trump did actually use the phrase that this was Biden's war.
Yes.
And in a technical sense, he was absolutely right. So, occasionally Trump, in fact, quite often, his analysis is very acute. Yes. And in this case, once Biden was elected, Zelensky's policies internally within Ukraine become much harder and encouraged from Washington. In particular, perhaps when the history books are written, we'll find that the very, very devious and, how can I put it, catastrophic role of Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor under Biden. And of course, the Secretary of State, whose name I've even forgotten now, because he ultimately was shaped by Jake Sullivan's. And of course, it was Jake Sullivan who, all the way back to 2016 under Hillary Clinton, was the one who devised the Russiagate farce or fiasco or hoax, or call it what you like. So, and once Biden was in, promising and really a very strong anti-Russian positions, the war opened up. But, the question indeed, Trump, first of all, has, while his analysis was fine, he as we all know, he lacks consistency in his positions. Yes. And many people say that basically he's very much influenced by the last person he's spoken to. As well as accompanied by some very deep prejudices. One of them is uncritical support for Israel. And as for the Ukraine war, he had, how can I put it, one of the deep feelings which we felt he did have, and which I don't think has gone. And that is an understanding that Moscow and Washington have to get on as the two world's largest nuclear powers, and that this mustn't be taken to an escalation point, which would lead to, a full-scale third World War. Why the Europeans and the UK can't take a different position? In fact, it's the opposite. Now that the so-called political West, the collective West, the Euro-Atlantic West, is beginning to split apart, with the Trumpites, the the maggots, as some people call them, MAGA, America Firsters, the maggots, let's call it that, who really initially did want to US to focus on domestic issues, and of course their critique of Europe is that it's opened the gates to migration, that it's lost its civilizational identity, civilizational erasure, as the National Security Strategy put it last November. But ultimately, as the two wings of the Euro-Atlantic alliance begin to split apart, and that's been a potential over many decades, and it's obviously clearly under heavier strain now than it has been earlier. As these two wings begin to split apart, the Europeans paradoxically have doubled down on the political West as a Cold War project. That's anti-Russian, militaristic, internally oppressive. Not, it could get far, far worse. The UK government, of course, in the vanguard of much of this, including the attempts now to, for example, just recently, a backdoor to iPhones, which was dropped a year ago under vast protest. And in fact, the Trump administration warned the UK government not to do it. But they're trying to do it again by the back door to have access to even iCloud and so on, which would be mass surveillance, which is very different from very selective access in a specific criminal case, which you can understand at that moment. If a judge, if someone says, clearly there is a case to be investigated, then, we're talking about pedophilia, we're talking about terrible crimes, which, threat of mass destruction for society. So at a very specific circumstance, yes, but we're talking about the UK government wanting mass surveillance, effectively a backdoor. So indeed, I'm often asked this question where you just are explaining why. And it's a cultural thing. It's a legacy they've never got over the Cold War.
It doesn't make sense to me.
Russophobia as well, a sort of colonial civilizational preeminence. Why they're doubling down on a failed enterprise, because clearly it's damaging Europe, damaging the UK economy as well. It doesn't make sense. But then you could say the answer is our current leaders, our current elites are simply inadequate. And of course they are. Boris Johnson was clearly a buffoon and a very dishonest. I mean, if I may, it is claimed that he is deeply dishonest in political terms. I'm talking, willing to make things up after the Skripal poisoning in 2018. He is quite clearly he said, for example, that the Portland Down had identified the so-called Novichok as coming from Russia, only to be countered a couple of days later by the head of DSTL, the weapons research laboratory, to say, no, we never have said that, and that isn't possible, and we didn't do it. And that's just one example of his role. And of course, Starmer was possibly even worse. I mean, it was hard to believe.
And so, Richard, I'm sorry, you mentioned the Western Atlantic kind of alliance, and you also mentioned how we're seeing cracks in that. Do you think those cracks are permanent and long-lasting, or do you think this is like a temporary thing that once we get through the Trump years, things will be back to normal? Personally, I don't see that happening, but I'm just trying to make some sense out of UK policy, because I'm thinking if the UK establishment realizes that things are changing permanently, then why are we not adjusting to the new reality of the world system?
Yeah, that's exactly the 65,000 ruble question, or yuan question, maybe we should call it. Absolutely. The world is changing. Two things. Yes, the European elites do hope that after Trump, we return to the status quo ante. But the status quo ante was already dissolving even before Trump. That he's a symptom of that, the change, the Atlantic drift, if you want to call it, the Atlantic rift, that it was developing. Obama already said we should focus on Asia, not in a benign sense, but in a sense that they would, how can I put it, extend the achievements and successes of NATO to the East Asian theater with later on we've got AUKUS and so on. So to take on China. But these issues won't go away, however formulated. So yes, there's a rift. There's no going back. And Europe now is accepting that. Some of the elites, the Macron, the British government, European leaders, Ursula von der Leyen, and as in particular Friedrich Merz in Germany. That's why they're talking about a European NATO, the Europeanization of security, investment in defense, defense partnerships, endless Franco-British, Franco Polish, a whole network of alliances. I mean, if I was to give you the list now, it would take 5 minutes because there's all sorts of this. In other words, those who favor that say Europe is finally taking responsibility for its security and willing to pay up for it. But this is being done at a time of severe financial constraint. So it is a question of guns or butter. You can't have both. And of course, Merz and others are going for guns. But Andy Burnham, our new Prime Minister, clearly is intent on butter. So he hasn't bought into this. He did not endorse the accelerated shift to spending 3.5% of GDP on defense. So there's, and of course, the European states, the continental states, don't have the resources either. So, and more than that, final point, the popular opinion doesn't support it either. There is no. The elites and the yellow press, as we used to call it, are whipping up war fever, but the people are just not buying it. Astonishingly across the world, even less. When opinion poll in 2024 was asking which countries you like, it was only Europeans very critical of Russia. The rest of the world, in many ways, put Russia first as the most trusted, most effective, and most respected state, along with China.
That's so true. I'm just wondering, do you know of any polls that have taken place on this in terms of public opinion on Ukraine or Russia? It would be interesting to know.
There was one. Of course, the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is part of the political West, effectively, does some very good work. But there was another one. I've forgotten who actually conducted it not long ago, which asked that question, a global survey of countries which you are most favorable to. So, yeah, and that's the one which I was quoted. I've forgotten which agency did it. But there's plenty of them, and that seems to be a consistent result. That, in other words, this policy of maximum pressure on Russia, of sanctions, which Russia now, including individual ones, is 35,000 sanctions on Russia. You couldn't make it up. The European Union, with its 21st package of sanctions, there's 50 countries invested in these sanctions, but that leaves nearly 250 which are not. And which, more than that, regard Western policy, the West, if you want to call it, the political West policy, as not only suicidal, but ultimately irrational. So, this war in Ukraine, which we started with, it is Europe's war. It's yet again another bout of these suicidal European wars. We had the First World War, which destroyed, ultimately weakened the United Kingdom, never fully recovered. Then we had the Second World War, which was absolutely catastrophic, so weakened Europe that it allowed the American century. The American century didn't last 100 years, is coming to an end. And these other major powers, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, we could list Pakistan, of course, very major countries. Pakistan, we're seeing how active it is today in trying to mediate an end to this latest West Asian war.
Yes, and I just simply don't understand the plans going on inside Europe, because if we see the changing world system as it is, we're going from a unipolar kind of world system to multipolar, and in those, at the moment, global powers at the moment, we can only see USA, China, and Russia maybe as global powers, and then we have like certain regional powers. Within that system, at the moment, it seems like America has less and less need for Europe. Russia, in the past, everything that they could previously get from Europe, they can now get that from Asia, because Asia technologically is getting more and more advanced by the day. So, and they're now Russia's big customers in terms of energy supplies and all of those things. So in that regard, Europe, instead of us putting our differences aside, trying to rebuild our industry and our place in the world, we're going around picking fights with these big players.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that. It's, as I say, it's irrational, quite apart from being suicidal and
Mm,
economically destructive. Europe is engaged in self-marginalization.
mm,
It's a structural systemic factor as much as just as policy making, given the fact, as you say, that the center of economic gravity moved to the Pacific basin 2 decades ago, that there's more,
mm.
the total GDP and intra Asian trade and so on is increasingly marginalizing Europe. The United States, on the other side, remains a source of intense innovation, competitiveness, and so on. Economic growth rates double, triple what we're seeing in Europe. So it's not quite clear. We had the Draghi report a couple of years back talking about European declining competitiveness, and this attempt to believe that military Keynesianism could act as their locomotive
Mm.
to pull the European economies out of semi-recession. They're not quite, they're registering 0.1%
Mm.
growth or that sort of level. So it's not quite in a recession, but definitely stagnating. And of course, we're seeing the German car industry laying off tens of thousands of workers. Just in the Financial Times this morning, the news that there's Varta, 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 electric batteries and so on, German company was closing down. One of the most illustrious companies. So much negative news, and the belief that investment in defense industries will act as a locomotive to get Europe out of this economic doldrums is a fantasy. First of all, to justify it, you need to even amp up the war fever even more, which could end very badly. And second, as we said, the population are not into it. And third, it's economically ineffective because
Yeah.
once you make a gun, once you make something, you blow it up or shell, that's over. Whereas if you invest in a railway, in a factory, in innovation, in education, in human skills, and so on and so forth, that's an investment for the future. Some of
Yes.
that's going on, but unfortunately, far too much. And Friedrich Merz, of course, the worst of the lot. Macron, who understood these things at an earlier stage in his leadership and seems to have forgotten what he.
Mm.
But of course, Macron was always like that. What he said in the morning would be countered by what he said in the afternoon, and something totally different by the evening. And of course, the British leaders, until today, as I say, Starmer lacked any intellectual heft whatsoever in analysing the security situation and economic development. And the only recourse for the British was closer links with Europe. Now,
Yeah.
that may be a good strategy. It may not be. But clearly, that boat has sailed,
Mm.
unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint. But practically, it is just not on
Mm.
to rejoin. And if Britain did try to join the European Union, it certainly wouldn't be on such advantageous
Exactly.
terms, so many opt-outs as they had before. So it's a
Yes.
dead end. The impasse of European politics, and the more the impasse deepens, the more aggressive they become
Mm.
against Russia. And to pick up your earlier point, you're absolutely right. I've always said this since the end of the Cold War, a pan-continental vision of economic and social cultural integration would have been the job.
Yeah.
Instead of which, you had the expansion of NATO.
Mm.
And it wasn't just NATO, it was expansion of the political West. That was
Mm.
NATO, that's the European Union. But above all, can I say, even the civilizational expansion, this
Mm.
vision that
Yes.
Russia was some sort of pupil to learn at the knee of
Mm.
Western European mother, as it were, was always not going to work with Russia, a proud civilization, just like Iran, just like
Yeah.
the subcontinental cultures of in the Indian subcontinent. So, or in that subcontinent, it just
Mm.
simply, that's not the way the world works. And
No.
yet, European elites were blinded by their civilizational arrogance, and this is what's led to this war.
Absolutely. This hubris that the West has in seeing themselves as the only civilization in the world, and all the others are barbarians that need to learn, is they just don't see how humiliating that is for the other side. Nations like Russians, the Chinese, Indians, Iranians, you mentioned, they're historic civilizations in their own right, with their own ways, their own cultures, their own successes in the past, and their own inspirations for the future. But the way we treat them is amazing. And I often think, even with China, when China looks at West and looks at Europe, China is often trying to learn from the successes of Europe and see how they can improve themselves. Whereas with Europe, we're just trying to give lectures to China, don't do this and don't do that. And by the way, can you give us our money? Which is just amazing.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Two things, though. There are these distinct, the civilizations, the Persian civilization, for example, which Trump threatened to blow to smithereens. I mean, really, this is beyond, unfortunately, I'm going to say belief, but unfortunately, it's real. And indeed, as you said, China with a civilization going back 5,000 years to the very beginnings, and so on. However, you mentioned multipolarity and of unipolarity earlier, but can I just put that a tiny bit into context?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I've, as you probably know, and I may have mentioned earlier, that I believe that when we discuss, people saying, look, the world order is coming to an end, or so on, the sky is going to fall in, and all the rest. It's again that classic Eurocentric civilizational arrogance and hubristic thinking, to use your term, that what that sort of analysis forgets is that we're living in an international system established in 1945, and it's based on the United Nations and the body of international law that has developed since then. This is what I call a charter international system. It's under unprecedented threat. Israeli warmongering, Western European warmongering of the Western Europeans and the United States have long tried to use the United Nations as an instrument in their struggles against others, rather than a forum to understand the concerns of others. In other words, for diplomacy, but diplomacy's gone out of the bomb. And the United Nations system has allowed now some 200 states to emerge. To reinforce your point about civilizations, but at the same time, the nation state is the basic unit of modern international politics. And there's some 200. And the principle they're based on is sovereign internationalism. Sovereignty, sovereignty, but internationalism as well. And that is multilateralism, hopefully working through other agencies. ASEAN is a very good example of that. BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and many, many more. These are not alternatives to the United Nations, but they reinforce the United Nations and that body of international law. Unfortunately, the political West, as a model of world order within the international system, used to compete against the Soviet Union. When that disappeared, the political West claimed to be synonymous with world order. In other words, to substitute for the body of international law and the United Nations. And that's why Israel, Ukraine, United States have contempt for the United Nations, because they say they think they stand above international law. But of course, and that's where the crisis of our times, the nexus, the focus of that crisis is there, accompanied by all these wars and all these internal repression. I'm thinking of Myanmar, Burma, which is absolutely catastrophic. In other words, these sovereign internationalist states are not just simply saying you can get away with blue murder. No, they are under the charter and the body of international law. It's the West which flouts these laws. It's the West which uses them instrumentally. And double standards isn't an accident. It's systemic, because they preach a commitment to the United Nations and international law. They practice, of course, they junk it. And this is why the so-called rules-based system was always a system which says we make the rules. It's our order, not the order epitomized by the United Nations. The United Nations, unfortunately, is in a real doldrums at the moment. The United States is not paying its dues. China, in part, makes up for it, but not directly, but through some of its agencies. So the battle is today between these models of world order, the one reflected by the political West, which is now fragmenting as well, which is leading to a lot of tensions, and the genuine charter international system, when the world came together at the end of the Second World War, the most catastrophic war in human history. So that I think is a sort of the terrain in which all of this is taking place.
No, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Also, Richard, I wanted to ask, so when this war in Ukraine started, I thought that was the most easily avoidable war that I could have thought of. And I was really surprised that we've ended up where we have. But then it seems like the war in Iran even tops what happened in Ukraine in terms of being an avoidable war. Do you think this is like this? Are we repeating the mistake that we made in Ukraine, in Iran, or do you think those two things are completely separate and they should be looked at separately?
No, it's the same hubristic approach of the political West and the Washington establishment. As you say, the Ukraine war was the most avoidable war in history. It was predicted, it was predictable, and it was avoidable, because all it would have taken ultimately, and I've argued this for 10, 15 years, just 5 words: Ukraine will not join NATO. Now, it's symbolic. Ukraine was not going to join NATO anytime soon. And in fact, you may have seen Valery Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian ambassador to United Kingdom and previous head of the army in Ukraine, said the Ukraine will never join NATO. So, but the point is, NATO was in Ukraine, which of course exacerbated things. Yes. But the vision of joining something which they knew was not going to be possible for decades is the root cause of this war. In other words, Ukraine abandoned neutrality. It wanted to join a military alliance whose very establishment was directed against Moscow, either in its Soviet or post-Soviet guise. And so it just exacerbated the situation, despite Moscow's endless warnings. Yes. And the fact the United States understood these warnings, and yet it ignored it in a voluntaristic and irresponsible manner. So Scott Horton wrote an excellent book called Provoked, which describes all of this in 600 exhaustive and brilliant pages. And my little book recently come out on the Russo-Ukrainian War, Follies of Empire, also makes these arguments I'm making now. As for the third Gulf War, I think it's what it's now called, or in fact, we recently made a calculation that this is the seventh major West Asian war since 1945. So I'm thinking of the 1967 Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the various invasions of Lebanon, and so on.
That's remarkable. I heard you talk about this, and this doesn't even include the intifadas.
Yes, it doesn't. That's right, exactly. There are lots of other little wars, and of course, there's a Yemen war continuing even today. So, as you say, the Iran war was a complete. Yeah. On the one side, Israel and Netanyahu wanted this war for 30 years. So, again, predictable. But it was only Trump which, as you've seen the transcripts of the talks, the discussions they had in the White House when Netanyahu visited, when Netanyahu said in late February this year, 2026, said that the regime in Iran would crumble and so on. Even Marco Rubio said it was a bullshit plan and it wasn't going to work. And yet Trump was convinced to do it. And of course, now the US is impaled on almost insoluble dilemmas. How to get out of this with a minimum losses. I mean, there's been huge losses within Iran, of course, and there's been huge global economic losses, and not above all, but no less important, a huge loss of prestige and status of the United States. I've been arguing, I think probably you have, for many years, that the United States has become not the source of stability and order, but the generator of disorder, instability, violence, and war. It's not only a force responsible, but it certainly doesn't help. And as I said, trying to extend that litany of success, in inverted commas, to Taiwan and East Asia.
Yes.
But as for going back to Persia, Iran, it was a totally voluntaristic act. They thought they could build on the so-called success of the kidnapping of Maduro in the first days of January this year. And they thought this would be as easy, especially after the protests in the early months of this year. But the attack and the sneak attack on the 28th of February, the assassination of world leaders. I mean, that's just...
Yes.
I mean, we're entering in an age of chaos, a rogue power. And what is so disgraceful and I speak as a patriotic British citizen, that our government didn't condemn it in harsher terms.
Yes.
Though, to give Burnham a credit, even just before he became leader, he did make a statement of Gaza, which I thought, in the circumstances, was quite brave. So, but we're not holding our breath. But certainly, I think that maybe British policy will become a bit more reflective.
Yes, one can hope. Yeah. Richard, also, I'm just wondering, so if we compare and contrast what's going on in Iran and what's happening in Ukraine, so USA is involved in both of those fronts, but directly against Iran and indirectly against Russia. But if we look at how the two wars were carried out, Iran has been very aggressive from day one, and is kind of attacked, taken the war horizontally across the region, to ensure that in some ways it's always on the top of the escalation ladder. So anything that the USA potentially can do against Iran, Iran has an answer for it in the region, to the point where USA seems to be running out of ideas, not knowing what to do. One day they want to negotiate, the other day they want to rip up the negotiations, go back to war, and then back to negotiations that aren't really happening at all. But if you compare that to what's happening in Ukraine, it seems like Putin from day one has been very careful and very kind of soft-footed in the way that he's handled the war, because he didn't want to broaden the war. He was careful that he doesn't want this to turn into a regional or a global war. But in some ways, it seems like that policy is now being criticized inside Russia, even, especially since the war in Iran started. People are saying if Iran can do this, have this kind of a response, then Russia is a much more powerful nation. Why is Russia pussyfooting around? And the war's been going on for so long now, and also that has meant that a lot of these European countries, they're taking this as a sign of weakness from Putin, which is actually a very dangerous thing to do. But how do you see those two different approaches, and how that the Iranian war is causing a lot of criticism for Putin inside Russia, as I understand it?
Yeah, that's very much the case. The Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia of oil installations, the wild berries, distribution centers, and even just recently, indiscriminate attacks against holidaymakers on the beaches of the Black Sea, which are all designed to provoke internal dissatisfaction, petrol shortages, and so on. And in response, the Russian views there is a very vociferous lobby saying, why, if, as you say, if Iran could do what it's doing, why can't we? Why don't we extend the war horizontally and attack the bases from which, and in fact, and also the surveillance planes, the British ones in the Black Sea, and AWACS and so on. Why don't we do this? The argument there would be, we have to restore deterrence. We have to use that to deter further escalation. We're seen as weak and not responding. So there's a very vociferous lobby asking for that. At the same time, on the other side, there is, if you like, the doves who are arguing. And you've probably seen the Economist a few weeks ago, where Andrei Melnichenko, this leading Russian businessman, argued that we have to put an end to this war one way or another, and business can help do it, and we need to refocus on domestic development, and so on. And German Gref, the head of Sberbank, Sber as it's now called, made similar statements. And of course, these are important voices. And Melnichenko's article in The Economist did get the Kremlin's approval. Maybe they wouldn't get. They underestimated its impact, but it was a very important statement of the view. We need to put an end to the war. And the argument there would be, look, declare victory and go, and say we've achieved some things in the classic manner. So those are the two positions, but there's a third position, and that is Putin's position. Just recently in a Navy meeting, he spoke when awarding medals to soldiers and sailors. He said later, one of the soldiers says, why don't we take the gloves off, as you say, and really take the war to the enemy? And Putin said, look, I'd love to move faster. I'd love to move harder. But, and his position is, actually, this war is contained, and of course they've tried to insulate it from the mass of the people, though of course that's failing now given the Ukrainian attacks. But his position ultimately may prove justified in the sense that Russia is advancing in the Donbass. Constantinople has effectively fallen. Dobropilia is threatened. They're moving within 5 kilometers of Slavyansk, and the strategy is working. They're also advancing in Kharkov region, Sumy. They're holding the line quite solidly on the Zaporozhye front. Ukrainians have made some counterattacks, and it's more and more evidence is coming that the Ukrainian attacks on Russia are a sign of desperation rather than of success. At the G7 summit, the leaders, of course, promised endless support. Trump said that Ukraine will be able to get the license to produce Patriot missiles, or counter-missile rockets. But that was then reneged on in a typical Trumpian manner within days. And anyway, Boeing wasn't going to accept to allow that, what is top secret to go to a country like Ukraine, which is absolutely riven by corruption. Within 10 days, it would be, the secret would be out. The secrets would be out. That was obvious. Anybody could see that. So, in other words, the Western promises, they're running out of arms to deliver. Certainly, Ukraine has fewer and fewer PVO, that is anti-aircraft stuff, anti-drone, anti-missile weaponry. So, and of course, they're also showing there's signs that they're running out of manpower on the front line. We've seen, of course, dreadful scenes of bussification, of people being dragged off the streets. And just recently, of course, there was this picture shown on TVs across the world of a father picking up, a single father picking up his son, a 5-year-old girl from nursery, from school. And he was then captured, taken away. The girl went, they've got a picture of the girl crying. In the end, he was released. But those pictures are dreadful. In other words, they're running out. And one has to make this point. Zelensky, even though he's lionized in the West, he's considered the Churchill of our time. In fact, he is as buffoonish and as clownish as Boris Johnson. The two went together, and Stalin, totally inadequate. These are inadequate leaders. Zelensky is willing to sacrifice his people to be able to join NATO. To join an alliance, so he wouldn't actually have to sacrifice his people in a war. Okay, they say they're keeping Russian barbarians at bay. Then we have all this civilizational talk, which we touched on earlier. This portrayal of Russians as orcs, as monsters, as barbarians. This sort of language, which we last heard, in the Belgian Congo, are just dreadful at the heyday of Western European imperialism and indeed anti-native peoples in the United States. It's just dreadful. And the fact that the Western are buying this when we've been talking about our values, which are tolerance, pluralism, multi-confessionalism, and so on. And the Ukrainian state, this ethnocratic nationalist state led by Zelensky, is doing the exact opposite. And of course, can I just make stress, this does not condemn, this is not to say that the Ukrainian people, the best of Ukraine is, I'm afraid, abroad today. There is another Ukraine, which is pluralistic, tolerant, multi-confessional, multilingual, and so on. And that is the Ukraine, the sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine, living at peace with all of its neighbors, above all Russia today. It's going to be hard work to create that. Hard work, but that's what we have to do. Not a Ukraine which is part of this militarized, NATO-centric or European NATO established body with a permanent division across Europe, a new Iron Curtain, far, far worse than anything we've had in the past. I mean, the idea, and I must say this, that the European Union immediately, the first days after the war, blocked all direct travel by air or train to Russia. That never happened at the height of Stalinism. I mean, this is just so beyond anything that, you say Russia invaded Ukraine. Yes, it did. Probably, I certainly have never endorsed or approved it. One understands why it happened. But that would have been the impetus should have been to understand why we got into this, instead of the Washington talking points, which the Western Europeans have now internalized, and they're incapable of thinking for themselves what is in the strategic interests of Western Europe itself, which is good relations with all of its neighbors, including Russia.
Yes. Richard, also, when looking at both of these fronts, the war in Iran and what's happening in Ukraine, when it all started, I personally thought that pretty soon we're going to see both of those fronts kind of, in some ways, joining up, because Russia and Iran are facing a common enemy. So that might bring them closer together in their war efforts. There have been some signs of it. There's been obviously Iran providing drones to Russia at the start of that war. Apparently, Russia's provided. Some people in the West are maybe exaggerating, maybe telling the facts that Russia is providing coordinates for Iran to attack Western powers. Although when talking to Iranian analysts, they get very offended when that comes up, because they're saying we have our own independent, locally manufactured equipment, satellites, all of these things. We don't need Russian support. But then there's also been the recent attacks by Ukraine of Iranian vessels in the Caspian Sea. There's also apparently Ukraine's involvement in West Asia, in terms of they've sent military advisors to Syria to see if they can damage Lebanon from there. They're also having some contracts with Saudi Arabia and other countries and providing them with anti-drone technology and all of these things. So there are some signs, but I'm surprised that it's not greater. And actually, when I talk to Iranian experts and analysts, they are actually pretty dismayed from their point of view, they think that Russia hasn't aided Iran as much as Iran aided Russia. How do you see that kind of difference of views in both sides, if there is a difference?
Oh, yes. At an earlier point, there was much talk of the CRINC alliance, that is China,
Yes.
Russia, Iran, North Korea. That was always greatly overblown. Each of these countries, I mean, China, Iran itself, which was always very careful not to get itself entangled into alliance system, even though there's friendship pacts of various forms. And North Korea is clearly not keeping out of the way as much as possible. So that was always overblown. But you're absolutely right. These two wars are merging at the margins. So far at the margins, yes, of course, not only Russia, but also China has been accused or suggestions of giving targeting data and so on. If they will deny it. So we don't know. And Iran, of course, does have much greater capacities than than some of the Westerners would think. So certainly, I think they may well be complementary. Who knows? So yeah, that's right. So Iranians, don't underestimate their commitment and, of course, capacities. But at the same time, the key thing is, as you say, these wars at the margins are overlapping. And of course, Zelensky wants nothing more than to internationalize his war in this way and to bring in the United States as a direct participant. And of course, he was saying this right from the start when Trump came in, to sell Ukraine as the mercenary power, as the new great military power in Europe, having been battle-hardened and battle-tested. Of course, all of that was an illusion. Ukraine is more than likely on the edge of some sort of, well, if not full-scale collapse, that even at the end of the war will be major turbulence. And of course, the Ukrainians are shifting technology to working with Israel in various ways, even though Israel has tried studiously to maintain neutrality in the Russo-Ukrainian war, because there's 1.2 million Russians, no more, 2 million perhaps, Russian people, how can I put it, Russophone people in Israel. So there's traditional links there. So there's a lot of wheels within wheels, of course, going on at the moment. But the big picture is that Ukraine is striving to generalize this war. This attack on this Iranian ship in the Caspian, it was 1,200, I can't remember whether it's kilometers or miles from Ukraine. So again, targeting must have come from the United States. Ukraine does not have that capacity. Again, Iran may, but Ukraine doesn't. So that was quite clearly a part of it. So Ukraine is trying to prove itself useful to Trump. In other words, so that then he would up the support and actually enter into direct conflict. And the talk at the moment of some sort of aerial ceasefire that would stop firing drones at each other and some sort of partial no-fly zone, it would be a huge victory for Ukraine. It's losing the aerial war. As I said, these attacks on Russia are a sign of desperation. Russia, of course, has ramped up the response, full-scale attacks on Odessa, on the ports, on petrol stations, on distribution center. Just recently, Brovary outside Kiev, an attack on a huge distribution center in response. So whatever Ukraine can do, Russia can do 10 times more. And it has taken off at least one of the gloves. Maybe one hand is still behind the back. The reasons you suggested, that Russia is very careful not to escalate the war, and Washington is, by the way, so that they don't enter into what would be the genuine foothills of the Third World War. This is a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis, but both sides are slow walking and trying not to get to the crunch point. But of course, Israel wants to ensure the United States is fully committed to its war in Iran. Ukraine wants to ensure. So the question in both cases is, who is the tail and who is the dog?
Yes, exactly.
And if you said this to Trump, of course, he would. It's a Trump. It's humiliation for the United States.
Yes,
whichever way you put it. Ukraine, it's got itself stuck into a proxy war with a major nuclear power, in which it cannot win against a nuclear power. I mean, we don't know what the definition of victory is, but nevertheless, any basic definition, we're all losers, of course, out of all of these wars. That's why I've been calling since the beginning for genuine diplomacy, for genuine understanding what the root causes of all these wars are, and to move beyond it, to go back to the United Nations Charter.
Yes. Richard, there's so many more questions I'd like to ask you, but we can keep those for another day. I think this might be a good place to end today's discussion. But before you go, please do, you mentioned your recent book. Do tell us about your book and where people can grab hold of it.
Yep. So the book is called The Russo-Ukrainian War, Follies of Empire. That's a subtitle. And it was published by Lynn Reiner Publishers out of Boulder, Colorado. And so any good bookshop would have it. I don't like to advertise Amazon, but it's listed there. And so one can certainly get information from that. I don't have my own personal website. That's a project maybe for the future. So that's, I'm afraid, there's no one point of finding my material yet.
Yes, I remember last time we spoke, you mentioned that one day you will make a website. It would be so useful. Or maybe think about Substack or something like that. It would be amazing, because I think so many people would love to find your work and get hold of you, share ideas.
Yeah, I must do that. Yeah, absolutely. I've got a Substack which I've never written in, but maybe once the holidays are over, this August is over, that'll be task number one.
Richard, thank you so much. I really am grateful for your time and your thoughts, especially in this really hot weather that we're going through at the moment. I'm really grateful for your time, and hopefully we'll speak again very soon.
It is always a great pleasure to talk with you. Thank you
very much. Have a good day.